My name is Robert Hale. I'm 67 years old, and for most of my life, I believed a man is measured by what he's willing to carry for his family. Years ago, they called me a criminal. I didn't fight it. I didn't deny it. I sat in a cold room, listened to my name being read like it belonged to someone else, and I signed the papers. Not because I was guilty, but because my daughter needed to walk out of that building free. I watched my reputation collapse so her future could stay intact. I let people look at me with disgust so they would never look at her that way. And I never once asked if it was fair. Because when you're a parent, you don't always get justice. Sometimes you get a choice, and sometimes that choice is to destroy yourself quietly so your child never has to. But tell me something. If the only way to save your child's life was to let the world believe you were a monster, would you do it? And before I tell you how I made that decision, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to know who's here with me in this moment. Before all of this, my life was small, not empty, just quiet. I woke up before sunrise the way my body had learned to do after 40 years of factory shifts. I made coffee strong enough to burn my tongue, fed the stray cat that kept coming back to the porch, and read the local paper even though nothing in it ever changed. I didn't need much. I had already lost the one person who made noise matter. After my wife died, silence became something I learned to live inside. Emily moved back home a year after the funeral. She said it was temporary. I didn't ask how long. Parents learn not to push when their children are trying to stand up again. She took the small bedroom at the end of the hall, the one that still smelled faintly like her shampoo from high school. I fixed the loose doorknob without telling her. I always fix things without telling her. She worked long shifts and came home exhausted. Some nights she'd sit at the kitchen table scrolling on her phone, staring at nothing in particular. Other nights she talked too much, filling the room with words like she was afraid silence might swallow her the way it had swallowed me. I listened. That was my job now. Emily had always been good, not perfect, just good in the way that mattered. She trusted people too easily. She believed apologies meant change. She thought love was something you earned by giving more of yourself than you should. That's how she ended up with debt she didn't talk about and a boyfriend I never liked but never confronted. I had learned that forcing advice on an adult child only teaches them how to hide better. When things fell apart with him, she cried once. Just once. In the car parked in the driveway thinking I couldn't hear. After that, she went quiet, paid off what she could, took extra shifts, told me she was fine. I pretended to believe her because sometimes believing the lie is the only way to keep peace. The trouble didn't arrive loudly. It never does. It came as a phone call while I was fixing a cabinet hinge. Emily's voice was too steady. That was the first sign. She said there'd been an accident, a coworker, a late shift, a mistake that didn't look like one until it was too late. Money moved where it shouldn't have. A signature added in the wrong place. Someone trusted the wrong person. By the time I understood what she was trying not to say, a man was dead. Not by her hands, not by intention, but because of a chain of decisions that ended where she happened to be standing. The investigators called it indirect, circumstantial, complicated. Words people use when they aren't sure who to blame yet. But uncertainty doesn't protect you. It invites suspicion. And suspicion, once it finds a young woman with debt and a shaky past, doesn't let go easily. They ask questions, then more questions, the kind that sound polite but feel sharp underneath. I watched Emily answer them, her shoulders stiff, her eyes searching the room for something solid to hold on to. She looked at me once, just for a second, not for help, for permission to be scared. That night, after they left, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house felt different, smaller, like the walls had leaned in to listen. I went over the facts again and again, the way an old man rechecks a locked door even when he knows it's secure. There were gaps. Missing pieces, assumptions stacked on top of each other like loose boards. Nothing solid, nothing safe either. I realized then that this wasn't about truth anymore. It was about convenience, about closing a file, about finding someone who fit well enough into the shape of the problem. And Emily, with her mistakes and her youth and her fear, fit too easily. I didn't sleep that night. I watched the hallway light glow under her door and wondered how a life could tilt so quickly. How something so ordinary could turn into something fatal. I had spent years believing that if you lived quietly and did your part, trouble would pass you by. I was wrong, and as the morning came, slow and gray, I felt something settle in my chest. Not panic, not anger, just a heavy understanding. the kind that tells you a fall is coming long before your feet leave the ground. They came back 3 days later, same quiet knock, different faces. They sat at my kitchen table with folders that never fully closed, like they already knew there was more inside than anyone wanted to deal with. They asked if we could talk alone. I nodded, and Emily went down the hallway without asking why. She trusted me to handle things. That trust weighed more than anything they were carrying in those folders. They didn't accuse anyone outright. That would have been too honest. Instead, they talked about possibilities, about timelines, about how money sometimes moves through hands without leaving fingerprints. They said Emily's name carefully, the way people do when they're already deciding how much damage they're willing to cause. I asked them what this could mean for her. The woman answered with a list instead of a sentence. Investigations, reviews, suspensions, the kind of future that slowly closes in on itself until there's nowhere left to stand. After they left, I stayed at the table and stared at the surface I had refinished myself years ago. I remembered sanding it down, layer by layer, until the scratches disappeared. Back then, I believed everything could be fixed if you worked long enough. That night, I went through old papers, not because they asked me to, because I needed to understand how the world would see us if this went further. My wife's medical bills, Emily's loan statement she thought I didn't know about, and then my own folder. Thin, old, still enough to matter. A past mistake that never followed me loudly, but never left either. That's when it became clear this wasn't about what happened. It was about who looked like they could have made it happen. Emily moved through the house like she was holding her breath. She tried to sound normal, tried to sound grateful. She said thank you for things I'd done my whole life without being asked. That's how I knew she was afraid. The call from the station came the next morning. They asked if I'd come in and help clear up a few inconsistencies. He said it like he was doing me a favor. I heard something else underneath it. At the table across from him, the questions came gently. About my past, about whether I'd ever helped Emily with paperwork, about whether I'd ever signed anything on her behalf. I answered what I remembered, and when I didn't remember clearly, I didn't rush to fill the silence. Silence can say many things if you let it. He slid a statement toward me. He called it a summary, not a confession, just his understanding of how things might have happened. I read it slowly. Some of it wasn't wrong. Some of it wasn't complete. All of it leaned in a direction I understood very well. I didn't correct him. I signed because signing meant the conversation ended, and ending the conversation meant they stopped knocking on Emily's door. When I walked outside, the sun felt sharper than it should have. Emily called me later and asked how it went. I told her they just wanted to understand a few things. I didn't say more. That night, she slept, the kind of sleep that only comes when someone else is awake, carrying the fear for you. I sat in the dark living room and realized something quietly, without panic or pride. Sometimes protecting your child doesn't require a lie. It only requires knowing when not to correct the story others are already telling. The letter arrived in a plain envelope. No warning, no emotion, just a date, a time, and a building I had driven past my entire life without ever thinking I'd have to walk inside. It said my presence was required. Not requested, required. By then, the questions had stopped coming to Emily. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Silence from authorities doesn't mean forgiveness. It means they've chosen a direction. The courthouse smelled like old paper and disinfectant. I sat on a wooden bench with my hands folded the way my wife used to fold hers in church. People passed by without looking at me. To them, I was already a type. An older man, a prior record, a convenient conclusion. The public defender assigned to me spoke quickly and softly, like speed might outrun consequence. He explained the situation in terms that sounded neutral, but weren't. The evidence was circumstantial, the timeline imperfect, but the paper trail leaned in one direction. And once that happens, momentum does the rest. He said the word liability more than once. He said my past wouldn't help. He said cooperation mattered. What he didn't say was that the story had already been written. When my name was called, the room went quiet in a way that felt rehearsed. I stood. I listened as my life was reduced to paragraphs, dates, transactions, assumptions stacked neatly together. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The judge asked if I understood the proceedings. I said yes. He asked if I had anything to add. I looked down at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the small crack near the corner that reminded me of our kitchen table at home. I thought of Emily waking up that morning, checking her phone and seeing no missed calls, No new notices, just another day she could step into without a shadow following her. I said nothing. That silence carried more weight than any sentence I could have spoken. The court took it as acknowledgement. The law doesn't require confession. It requires resolution. The ruling came swiftly. Fines, probation, a permanent mark that doesn't fade with time or good behavior. No prison, not mercy. Calculation, enough punishment to close the file. Enough consequence to make the system feel complete. I felt relief and loss collide in my chest. Relief because Emily's name was not spoken again. Loss because I understood what this meant for me. Jobs I would never be offered. Doors that would never open. Conversations that would always end too early once people learned. Outside, the sky was painfully blue. Emily called while I was standing on the courthouse steps. She asked how it went. I told her it was handled. I told her it was over. She cried, not because she knew what I'd lost, but because she believed she'd been spared. That night, I signed more papers. Restrictions, conditions, words like compliance and monitoring. The law's way of reminding you that even when you're free, you are still being watched. I went home and sat in the living room without turning on the lights. Emily made dinner. She talked about work, about plans, about things that assumed a future untouched by this place. I nodded at the right moments. I smiled when expected. When she went to bed, I opened the drawer where I kept my copy of the court documents. I read them slowly, not because I didn't understand, but because I needed to feel the weight of what had been decided. This wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about consequence. The law had done what it was designed to do. It found the path of least resistance and followed it to the end. And I let it. Because some outcomes are not chosen. They are accepted. And as I sat there in the quiet, I understood something with painful clarity. The price had been named. The payment had been taken. And there would be no appeal that could ever return what I had quietly agreed to give up. Time didn't move forward after the ruling. It flattened out. Days became identical enough that I stopped marking them. I followed the conditions, showed up where I was told, signed what they put in front of me, learned how to answer questions without offering more than required. That's what life becomes when your name lives in a database instead of a memory. Emily moved on. That was the point. She picked up extra shifts, talked about saving for her own place again, started laughing in the kitchen the way she used to, like sound itself was proof she'd survived something. Every time she did, I felt the strange relief of knowing the trade had worked. The letter came months later, different envelope, different tone. This one asked instead of demanded. It said a review was being conducted. Routine, they called it. New oversight. Old cases. Language designed to sound harmless. But nothing ever comes back unless something didn't sit right the first time. I almost didn't respond. When you've lived long enough, you learn not to wake sleeping things, but ignoring it felt like lying again. And I had already used up whatever credit silence gives a man. The woman who called herself a senior prosecutor didn't speak like the others. She asked fewer questions, let pauses stretch until they became uncomfortable. She didn't ask what I did, she asked how the story had come together so neatly. She had noticed things, dates that didn't align, a transaction logged twice under different assumptions, a witness statement that had been summarized instead of quoted. Nothing explosive, just enough friction to slow a machine built for speed. She never said my name like it was a problem. She said it like it was a variable. When she asked why I hadn't clarified certain points earlier, I told her the truth without telling it all. I said I had answered what was asked. I said no one had invited anything beyond that. She nodded, like she'd expected exactly that answer. The review didn't stop the conditions. It didn't erase anything. But it changed the way people spoke to me. Less certainty, more careful language. The system doesn't apologize. It adjusts. Emily noticed the calls, the mail. She asked if something was wrong. I told her it was probably nothing. That word again. Probably. The lie parents use when the truth would ask too much of a child who's already paid enough. Weeks passed, then months. Then one afternoon, the prosecutor called back and said something I hadn't prepared for. She said there was reason to believe the case had been simplified. That responsibility might not have been distributed accurately. She said they were considering reopening portions of it, not to accuse, to understand. I thanked her and hung up. My hands shook for the first time since the courthouse, not because I wanted my name cleared, but because clarity has a way of reaching places you meant to protect. That night, I sat across from Emily at the table. She talked about work, about a patient who reminded her of her mother. Or am I? about how tired she'd been lately without knowing why. I watched her and realized something the law never accounts for. Truth doesn't arrive alone. It brings consequences with it. If the case reopened, questions would return, not just to files and forms, but to memories, to choices, to her. And I wasn't sure what part of the story would survive being handled a second time. When I went to bed, sleep didn't come. I stared at the ceiling and understood the cruelest part of delayed justice. It doesn't ask what you were trying to protect. It only asks what can still be undone. The door I had closed for her was beginning to open again, and for the first time, I didn't know whether I should step forward or stand in the way. The name didn't mean anything to me at first. It was buried halfway down a page I almost didn't read. A consultant. External. Temporary. Someone brought in to help organize the financial review after the accident. The kind of role no one remembers once the paperwork is finished. The prosecutor mentioned him casually, like an afterthought. She said his summaries had guided much of the early understanding of the case. Not decisions, just framing. The way facts are arranged before anyone asks what they actually mean. I asked if there was a reason his work was being looked at now. She said there were discrepancies, small ones, numbers rounded where they shouldn't have been, assumptions stated as conclusions, a timeline that only made sense if you already believed a certain person was responsible. That person wasn't Emily, not directly, but she was close enough to be useful. As they dug deeper, a pattern emerged. The consultant had been involved in 2 other reviews with similar outcomes. Different names, same shortcuts, files closed quickly. Careers quietly redirected. In every case, someone less protected carried the weight so the institution could move on. He wasn't after my daughter. He was after efficiency. And when he realized there was an older man with a past who wasn't correcting the narrative, he adjusted the lens just enough for the picture to sharpen around me. The prosecutor didn't say this was intentional. She didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. Edits tracked. Versions saved, a trail of decisions that leaned consistently in one direction without ever crossing a line that could be called illegal outright. By the time Emily's name stopped appearing in the updated drafts, mine was already fixed in place. The truth landed slowly, not like an explosion, more like pressure, the kind that makes your ears ring before you realize how deep you've gone. I thought about the night I signed the statement, about how carefully it had been worded, how nothing in it was technically untrue, just incomplete in all the ways that mattered. The consultant hadn't forced anything. He had simply shaped the space where silence became agreement. When the prosecutor told me they were considering formal findings against him, I asked what that would mean for my case. She paused, a longer pause than before. She said it complicated things. If they acknowledged manipulation, they would also have to acknowledge how easily the system accepted it, how quickly it moved once a path appeared, and how many people benefited from that speed. That kind of truth doesn't just correct a mistake, it exposes a habit. Emily began asking questions around the same time, not about the case, about me, about why I seemed tired in a way that sleep didn't fix, about why mail from the courthouse still arrived when everything was supposed to be over. I told her some reviews were happening. I didn't tell her why. I didn't tell her about the consultant, or that the story she believed might have been constructed without any single villain, just a series of people choosing the easiest version of events. One night, she asked me if I'd ever felt pressured. I said everyone feels pressure eventually. That answer wasn't enough. I could see it in her eyes. The truth has a way of leaking even when you try to seal every crack. The prosecutor called again weeks later. She said they had enough to act, not enough to promise resolution, enough to admit the case had been influenced by someone who was never supposed to have that kind of control. She asked me if I wanted to pursue it further. That question sat between us like a weapon. If I said yes, the past would reopen. Emily would be pulled back into a story she believed she'd survived. If I said no, the consultant would become another footnote, another quiet operator who learned exactly how far he could push without consequence. I realized then that my original choice had created a second one, and this time there was no version where everyone walked away untouched. The call ended without an answer. I sat alone in the dark and understood something I hadn't before. My silence hadn't just protected my daughter, it had taught someone else how to hide behind it. And now the truth was standing at the door, asking not whether it deserved to be heard, but who was willing to pay for letting it in. The answer I gave them was simple. I told the prosecutor I didn't want to reopen anything. I said I understood the findings. I said I appreciated the review. And I said I was ready to move on. She didn't argue. People who work in that system learn quickly when a door is meant to stay closed. She just asked if I was sure. I said yes and meant something different than certainty. When the call ended, the house felt heavier, like it had absorbed the weight of every word I didn't say. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the place where Emily used to leave her keys. That small, careless habit was proof of freedom. I wasn't about to take it from her. Emily sensed the shift. She always had. She started watching me the way children watch parents, when they know something is wrong but don't know how to ask without breaking it. She didn't accuse. She wondered, and wondering, I learned, can last longer than knowing. She asked if everything was really over. I told her yes. I didn't look at her when I said it. Some truths survive better when they aren't asked to meet anyone's eyes. Life settled into something that almost looked like normal. Emily moved into her own place, painted the walls a color she'd always wanted but never dared to choose. She invited me over for dinner and cooked meals that were too ambitious for one person. She laughed easily, but not freely. There was always a moment, right before sleep, where her mind seemed to wander somewhere she couldn't name. I stayed where I was. I followed the rules, reported when required, signed when asked. The law never called again. That was their version of closure. People in town forgot, or pretended to. I became background, the man who keeps to himself, the man with a past that doesn't come up in polite conversation. I learned to live inside that silence. Emily never stopped asking questions, not out loud, but I saw them in the way she paused before trusting people, in the way she read documents twice, in the way she never again believed a story just because it was told with confidence. That was the cost I hadn't calculated. I had saved her future, but I had changed how she walked into it. Sometimes late at night, I imagined what would happen if I told her everything. The consultant, the manipulation, the choice I made when silence became a shield. In those moments, the truth felt like relief. But relief for me has never been the goal. Parents don't get closure. We get decisions. The last letter I received from the court went unopened for weeks. When I finally read it, it said nothing new. Just confirmation that my file was inactive, closed, complete. I placed it back in the drawer and shut it gently, the way you close a door to a room you don't plan to enter again. Emily called the next day. She said she'd been offered a promotion. She sounded proud, and underneath it, cautious. I congratulated her and meant it with everything I had left. After we hung up, I sat alone and realized something that no ruling, no review, no correction could ever change. I had chosen my ending the day I stopped correcting the story. And as long as Emily lives a life untouched by what almost destroyed her, I can carry the rest in silence. Because some truths don't need to be spoken to be paid for. They just need someone willing to hold them until the end.